So I'd like to introduce our speaker, James Bilder, who has his bachelor's in journalism from Lewis University and a master's from Loyola University. He has written a previous book with his father, Michael, A Foot Soldier for Patton, about his time during serving in World War II in Patton's army. And the subject of his talk tonight is his book, Artillery Scout, the story of a forward observer with the U.S. Field Artillery in World War I. So everyone, please give a big round of applause for James Bilder.
Thank you all very much. It's a great honor to be here. I have been coming, I'm from Palos Heights, born and raised on the southwest side, and I have been coming to Cantigny since I was a small boy. My maternal grandfather, my mother's dad, served in the First World War and conscripted and served as a forward observer, as we're going to discuss shortly. And his son-in-law, my own father, was a rifleman in General Patton's Third Army. He was with the 5th Infantry Division. And it was interesting, he was conscripted in April of 1941 for what was supposed to be a 12-month hitch. And the attack on Pearl Harbor kind of changed that. So 4.5 years later, he was able to return safely. But in some ways, things never change. And I'm just kind of curious. I normally don't ask this, but I've been giving this presentation enough during the last year that I think I'd like to. For those of you who served in the military, do we have any forward observers present this evening? Anybody that was now? Okay, good. We got a couple of spotters. Good. One of the things that you'll both discover is not a lot has changed. Equipment has changed, but the basic principles remain the same. So with that, I'd like to talk about the First World War. A little over 100 years ago, as you all know, in 1914, Europe was a virtual powder keg. The Triple Entente, which was the Allied powers, you'll notice in green behind me, there was an alliance between England, France, and Tsarist Russia. And the Central Powers, because they were involved in the central portion of Europe, and who would basically in the Second World War become the Axis powers, were Germany and the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And later other belligerents joined the Ottoman Empire, modern-day Turkey, and then, of course, Bulgaria joined the Central Powers, and Greece and Italy and others. Romania fell in with the Allied powers, and eventually the United States as well. How did it start? Well, as many generals have said, if we only had known how it started. We do know that the Austrian-Hungarian Empire was incredibly complex. It encompassed the Balkan region. There had been 2 very large Balkan wars in 1912. It was a very eclectic empire, very hard to govern. And the Kaiser had sent his nephew to that area with the hope of reestablishing better ties between the imperial government and the various people that made up what we would later come to know as Yugoslavia. He was assassinated, and that, of course, occurred on July the 1st of 1914. And everyone had kind of hoped that, well, perhaps this will pass without too much difficulty. But the Austrian-Hungarian Empire said, we feel that the Serbians are responsible for this and that it'll be our obligation to go in and crush Serbia. And the Tsar Nicholas II in Russia said, well, we feel that we're the protector of the Serbs. And contrary to what some people think, there was no formal defense treaty or alliance between Serbia and Tsarist Russia. So the Tsar decided to mobilize as a check move to the Austrian-Hungarians. The Germans issued what we now refer to as the blank check and said they would stand with the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. This, of course, forced the French to mobilize. So before you knew it, from July the 1st, by July the 28th, the Austrian-Hungarians had marched on Serbia. By August the 1st, the remaining powers would be at war because one of the things that the Germans had planned on doing was a quick conquest of France, the Schlieffen Plan. And they would move along the Channel coast and then down around Paris, and they'd be able to seize the French capital and quickly knock the French out of the war. As we know from the First Battle of the Marne, things did not work out quite the way that the Germans had intended. But they had marched through Luxembourg, neutral Luxembourg, and that, of course, brought the British in as belligerents, and they, of course, allied themselves with the French. So by the time the summer had just kicked off. As you can see, the warring powers were pretty well established. How did the United States get involved? Well, we were able to stay neutral for roughly a 3-year period of time. And in 1916, when President Woodrow Wilson was running for re-election, his particular campaign promise or slogan was, "He kept us out of war." Contrary to what some people think, it was not the sinking of the Lusitania, which occurred in 1915. That had been sunk off the Irish coast. The British knew that there were active German U-boats there. They denied destroyer escorts. It is now a confirmed historical fact that the Lusitania did have munitions on board. Not that that's an excuse to sink a civilian liner, but we understand that the mentality at the time was winning was what was important. When the Germans sank that ship, they killed over 100 Americans, close to 130, and the United States had thought we might need to enter this conflict. But Wilson decided, in his own words, there was such a thing as being too proud to fight. So the United States avoided a military conflict at that time. Wilson went on and was very, very narrowly reelected to a second term on a peace platform. His opponent was Supreme Court Justice Charles Evan Hughes, who was very closely backed by former President Theodore Roosevelt. And Theodore Roosevelt, as we all know, believed in the bully pulpit and a big stick. And he was very much in favor of the United States entering the war on the Allied side. Wilson, as I say, narrowly won that election on that peace platform. It took 3 days until Election Day had passed before they knew the outcome. People like my own grandfather, Leonard Fairfield, were breathing a sigh of relief. But 1917, things took a very dramatic turn. The Germans announced in February of that year that they were going to reinstitute unrestricted submarine warfare. And what that meant was that any ship, neutral or belligerent, which was approaching the British Isles could be sunk. And the reason was they had hoped that they could starve England into submission. So American merchant ships were being sunk on their way to deliver supplies, primarily war materials, to the British. Also, we know about the famous Zimmermann telegram. Foreign Minister Zimmermann of the German government issued an offer to the Mexican government and said that if you'll side with Germany and go to war with the United States, we will return Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico to you. And we may be able to get the Japanese to switch from the Allied side to the Central Powers side, and maybe there'll be some things in the Pacific for you as well. When word of the Zimmermann telegram reached the American public roughly on March the 1st, the country was outraged. So between the ship sinkings and the offer to draw Mexico into the war against the United States felt that there was no other alternative but to declare war. And on April the 6th, which was just the 100th anniversary last month, that was the noting of the American declaration of war against Germany. And I see that there are a couple of people who look like they're of grade school or high school age. What do you think of this young man right here? What do you think of if I say December the 7th? Pearl Harbor, which was 1941, the Second World War. But what a lot of people don't know is actually December the 7th was an important date for war when the United States entered in 1917, because that was the date that the United States declared war on Austria-Hungary. And we never actually declared war on either Bulgaria or on the Ottoman Empire. So we weren't belligerents with them. We did send some troops to northern Italy to help fight the Austrian-Hungarians, and Americans were also sent to Russia. And they were involved in the civil war between the whites and the reds. And Americans were at Archangel, and they were also at Murmansk and Vladivostok, which is a very convoluted and an entirely different topic, but just to let you know, we did have troops all over the globe. Most of the Americans would serve, though, in France. One of them, my grandfather, Leonard Fairfield. The only picture I have of him in uniform, we had some terrific pictures, 4 or 5 of them, in fact, where he was with his horse Annabelle and his associate Al Slowey. Unfortunately, a few years after my grandfather died in 1962, my grandmother had a burglary. The only thing they took was the strong box, which had nothing of monetary value, but had some love letters and pictures of my grandfather's World War I service. So those are forever gone. Here you can see Leonard Fairfield at Camp Logan outside of Houston, Texas. And the camps in the northern portion of the United States were primarily made of wood, such as Camp Grant out in Rockford. But the camps that were in the southern half of the United States, most of those were what we referred to as tent cities. And they had two small lines running over the top of the tent, which could supply enough power to get a light bulb lit in the evening. They had pumps in order to get the water out. Leonard, as you can see, there's the cigarette in his hand, which he was always proud of. He died of lung cancer in 1962. You can't really see it too well, but up there are two electrical lines, which give you an idea. These tents housed anywhere from 6 to 10 men. This was an especially brutal time during the training, but before I get to the training, let me just show you one thing up ahead. When the United States declared war on April the 6th, 1917, we only had about 130,000 men serving in the United States Army and about roughly the same number in the Army National Guard. Most of these men were dramatically ill-equipped and certainly not trained. The only people who could be considered qualified for combat was an exceptionally small number of men who had served on the punitive expedition in Mexico in 1916. There we had Pancho Villa had crossed into Columbus, New Mexico. Some Americans had been killed. And in response to that, and the Mexican government was supportive of it, the United States sent troops into the north of Mexico to search out Pancho Villa. It's not quite as big a failure as a lot of people may have thought. Actually, that was where George Patton engaged in the first armored or mobile attack. He mounted some machine guns in the back of some Dodge touring cars, and he was able to kill Pancho Villa's second in command. Let me see if this, good. This was the draft card. The United States did not get enough men to sign up, so on May the 18th, 1918, the United States, for the second time in its history, put conscription into effect. So they only got about 200,000 men to voluntarily join. They needed 10 times that amount at a minimum, so they said, guess what? You're going to be drafted. So June the 5th, 1917 was known as National Draft Day. And if you were between the ages of 21 or 31, American citizen or an alien, you had to register for the draft. So you can see it's Leonard Francis Fairfield. He was age 24 at the time. He was at 1009 West 55th Street in Chicago. I got this off Ancestry.com, by the way. So if you're interested in family history for yourself, that's a great place to be able to go, or sites like it. He was born on November the 7th of 1892, so he fell right into that 21 to 30-year-old. He was a natural-born citizen, and he was a valveman. And what he was he had been trained as a stationary engineer. He worked for People's Gas at 95th in Baltimore, and he read different tanks and made slight adjustments there, and then he would record those and read the gauges, and he'd make a complete report at the day's end. He was single. He was a Caucasian. He was not married. They ask your height if you're tall or if you're medium. He was 5'7.5", so he fell into medium. There they ask if you were slender or stout. I always think that's kind of interesting. It's kind of a dated term. He fell into the slender. He had gray eyes, light hair. I happen to know this because my grandmother used to tease him about this. He had a size 7 foot, so he was not a real tall man. One thing my grandfather did have is he was exceptionally gifted, and it was a natural gift, at mathematics and things that were related to engineering. He had a very strong natural aptitude. He had to quit school after grammar school to help support the family. His father had a drinking problem, and he heroically, as the oldest in the family, kind of took up where his father really should have been. But self-educated, and would eventually rise to a nice position heading a plant with Union Carbide in his later years. I've often been asked, sometimes when I'd say my grandfather served in the First World War, and they say, well, did he survive? And yeah, I probably wouldn't be here if he hadn't. There were a number of draft boards throughout the city. And as you can see, this is indeed dated June the 5th, 1917. This was the first of several drafts. By the time that the war was ending in the fall of 1918, the draft age had gone all the way up to age 46. So you start out very young, and then as the manpower kind of dwindles down. You need more. There were a total of 4 million men that would go into the armed forces. And when I say the armed forces, I mean specifically I'm talking about ground forces, the United States Army and the U.S. Marine Corps. Not that plenty of men didn't enlist in the Navy, but in terms of ground troops, 4 million men went into uniform, 2 million of whom actually got to France, and 2 million of whom just remained here in the United States. As you would know if you're at all interested in the First World War, or if you viewed things here, the Battle of Cantigny took place in May of 1918. So we declared war in April of 1917. We sent General Pershing over to France in June of 1917, and he arrived with himself and his staff. And as he marched down the street, everybody was, well, where's that American army? It didn't exist. They referred to General Pershing as the general without an army. So it took a full year before we could get enough men trained and over to Europe. As a matter of fact, we didn't suffer, which is brought out here in one of the museum exhibits. There were no Americans killed in the war by enemy action until November of 1917, when 3 men were killed in a trench raid. So we were at war for 6 months, a world war, without any deaths due to enemy action. This is, as the troops would train, once they were put on ships to go over to Europe, and of course submarines were a potential problem, they painted the ships kind of a blue and gray, hopefully which would camouflage it against the sky. It's a practice that they didn't consider pragmatic in the Second World War. But when you left the United States for Europe, or when the war was over and you were returning from Europe to the United States, you had to complete these particular cards. I arrived in New York on the transport, and there's the name. We'll go at once to camp, whatever it might happen to be, Merritt, probably in New Jersey, and we'll write from there, signed, and then, now this is not my grandfather, this was courtesy of the Illinois National Guard, 33rd Brigade, and there's his battery unit, and that was what they would do. So they would send that, and that way, even if soldiers didn't write all that much, which they often don't tend to do, my father would mention that, when you're sitting in a hole covered with excrement, finding a piece of paper and a pencil is not normally on your mind, so writing home doesn't occur all that frequently. So having these form letters to just kind of sign, or cards and say, okay, I'm here, you don't have to worry, I made it, was what the service would do to help the people back home stay a little bit calmer. My grandfather was conscripted in the fall of 1917. As you saw in the card, he registered on June the 5th. The 33rd, what was then the 33rd Division, now it still exists. My son, who's here tonight, served 3 years there before he transferred to the 28th Division when he moved to Pennsylvania. But the 33rd Division served heroically in both the First and the Second World Wars. In the Second World War, they were in New Guinea and Luzon. But in the First World War, they would go to France. Their artillery units, however, were separated from the infantry. When they trained, the 122nd, the 123rd, and the 124th Field Artillery, along with the 108th Ammunition Train, were rolled over into what was known as, it was a wartime creation, the 58th Field Artillery Brigade. And I know you've all heard the word circus when we talk about the First World War, and everybody thinks immediately of Richthofen's Flying Circus. And they were called that because the planes were painted this really incredible set of daring colors. And that's really an interesting story, but not all that factual. The planes were indeed painted in bold colors, Richthofen kind of taunting the enemy. But the reason that they were referred to as circus is because they moved very rapidly. What we think of as airports or air bases, in the First World War, they were known as aerodromes. And anything that could pack up overnight, move, resituate itself, and get itself reconstructed and operational was known as a circus, just as an actual entertainment circus could do. So my grandfather's outfit, the 58th Field Artillery Brigade, were known as a circus unit because they could move very rapidly. And they actually they were detached from the 33rd. They supported 4 different infantry units during their 2.5 months in combat, which is primarily what the United States actually did, was serve 2.5 months of major combat. The Battle at Cantigny in May of 1918, 13 months after the United States entered the war, that was a regimental-size outfit that took that city. Chateau Thierry and Belleau Wood, and we all know about Belleau Wood, where the Marines really kind of made their reputation for what we recognize them all today. That was basically a divisional-size outfit. And then when we saw the Second Battle of the Marne in July 1918, that was a corps-size operation. And by the time we got to Saint-Mihiel in September of 1918, now we were up to a full-size army. So it took almost a year and a half, but it's amazing because in that period of time, 116,000 Americans were killed, mostly in those last few months, 63,000 from disease, 53,000 from combat-related injuries. That's more men in just a few months than we lost during the entire 11-year period of the Vietnam War. So it's an absolutely astronomical amount of men. And the Battle of the Argonne, we had 26,000 Americans killed, which is the highest number of deaths of any battle the United States has been involved in, and that includes Gettysburg or the Battle of the Bulge or any other conflict that we'd care to name. This is Camp Valda. It's still located in France near the Swiss border. Camp Valda is an artillery school. Artillery became a real science with the First World War. Prior to the First World War, basically cannon fire was what we would think of as rifle fire. So Parrott guns, Napoleon guns, things that had minimal elevation in their barrels would fire directly at oncoming troops, or they could position to be firing at a hillside or a fortification of some type. That was what artillery was based. You pointed and you fired. It became a lot more sophisticated, being able to actually calculate things in variables like the angle of fire. This was where howitzers started to come into play. Now there were guns that could move at very steep angles, fire large projectiles at a high rate of speed, high into the air, and those would drop a relatively short distance away onto an enemy position. In some cases, the trenches between the Germans and the Allied troops were only 100 yards apart. And of course, that entire area known as no man's land in between was covered with barbed wire, and that's where the infantry would have to move back and forth in their battles. Artillery was so deadly that in 70% of the people who died in the First World War as a result of battle were killed by artillery. And bayonets only accounted for 1% of death, and poison gas also accounted for 1% of death. So artillery was not only a highly effective weapon, it was a terror weapon. We know that this is where we saw enormous numbers of cases concerning what was then called shell shock, what became known in the Second World War as battle fatigue, and what we now refer to as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. And you may have seen some of those silent films with men quivering uncontrollably. In some cases, you'll hear stories, and this again goes right up to modern-day conflicts, where all a person would have to do is clap their hands, and an individual would not be able to hold their bowels any longer. So a very, very devastating weapon. Camp Valda would be the French equivalent to Fort Sill in Oklahoma. It was here that my grandfather learned really what he kind of referred to as the art of death. Here we can see a French 75 millimeter cannon. The French 75 was developed in the 1890s after the French had been humiliated in the 1870 Franco-Prussian War and had lost the Lorraine province of France to Germany. That was now part of the German Empire. The French wanted to develop the most effective rapid-fire cannon that was possible, and they actually did. The 75 millimeter, which is the standard artillery piece that the Americans used, and why? We didn't have anything, folks. We had about 100 3-inch guns, literally. Most of those made it to Europe, but very few of them actually ended up getting positioned into combat. The French supplied us and the British with just about everything. Our planes. We had some Jennies, which were basically used in Mexico for observation. We had one plane that was considered combat capable. It wasn't even a fighter. So everything that was supplied to us in terms of aviation, SE-5s, Newport 28s, SPAD 13s, these were all supplied by the British and the French. The Show, which is something like the World War I variant of a Browning automatic rifle, nowhere near as effective, and certainly nowhere what would I want to say, nowhere near as desired, but supplied by the French. The Hotchkiss machine gun supplied by the French. Even our rifle, we often think, the 1903 Springfield rifle. We had 600 of those in our arsenals at the time that we went to war. Most of those went to the Marines. But actually the United States, the primary weapon that was utilized was the American Enfield. And we had been manufacturing, that's a British rifle, Enfield rifles for the British. And when the United States went to war, the Enfield was patented. So there was a thought, we don't want to interfere with the British patent, do we? So we'll change it from a 303 to a 30-06, and there we go, the American Enfield. So that was the bulk of the weapons that was used by the Americans. My grandfather trained at Camp Logan with wooden rifles. They had to get basic intro. Everyone, I know the Marine Corps, and God bless them, this is not a criticism of the Marine Corps. Marine Corps says every man is a rifleman. Well, theoretically in service, every individual is supposed to be a rifleman. Two things you're supposed to always be able to do is to learn how to march and learn how to use a rifle. We had wooden weapons for the soldiers to train with. They trained with wooden cannons, and they had no horse teams. So the wooden cannons were pulled around by 6 soldiers tied together with twine to imitate horses. Now, this is the reason the French 75 got the reputation it did. I want you to notice right here, I want you to notice the recoil of this gun. This is a hydropneumatic system. So what they did, the French found a way to engineer this so that a discharged shell, the escaping gas would be housed, and that would allow the barrel to roll back. There were rollers beneath that barrel. There was a spade in the ground, which helped to keep the artillery piece in place. And then as that barrel absorbed the recoil and shot back, correspondingly it ejected the casing, that would allow the cannon piece to stay in place. What happened during the American Civil War and other such wars, when those guns were put into place, if you attempted to use a brake or to anchor those in any way, the gun would flip, or the barrel would simply break off of the casing and kill the users, the operators. So by doing this, you could have an artillery piece that you had to make minimal adjustment in. Here, the shortcoming was the elevation of the barrel was only about 4%. So you couldn't get a tremendous, it wasn't like a howitzer, but you could have the ability to have some variation on an attacking enemy. So the fact that it was able to get off 15 rounds in a 60-second period of time and that it could fire either gas shells, high explosives, or shrapnel shells made it highly desirable. Normally the crews, there were 6 men in a crew. Operational, though, there would be 3. So you would see someone that would actually be dealing with the ammunition as it was stocked. You would see a loader, and then the lanyard would be pulled here. Normally a battery commander would be close by. In the First World War, they used megaphones. So in order to try and speak over the din, they would do that. Also, one of the things I'll just bring up here real quickly, I often get asked this question: why are American soldiers referred to as doughboys? Right? I mean, and you know, it's kind of sad today when you think of doughboy, right? We always think of Pillsbury, and you're going to poke that little cutie in the tummy, and he giggles and the whole bit. There's not a definitive answer. There's a couple. Some people say the haversacks or the buttons resembled dough, and as a result, they were called doughboys. Some people said that the British and the French originated that term because American were paid so much higher than their Allied counterparts. Probably it goes back to the fighting that had taken place during the Native American wars with the Apaches. The Americans who fought there and who also fought in the Philippines and in Puerto Rico and Cuba during the Spanish-American War, very sweaty, great deal of perspiration, a lot of dust, and they would get caked with these. And as a result, they looked like men made of dough. So most historians, again, it's not proven, but most historians tend to agree that that's the origin of the term doughboy. Even the saucepan helmets, those were from the British. We produced them, but it was their design. And then here you can see, as I said, this picture was taken during the Argonne Offensive. Although these cannons normally had a crew of 6, as I said, 3 individuals could operate it effectively. You can see the high number of casings that are left. This was a gun that could, if you wanted to put down rapid fire, this was definitely a gun to do it. This is another picture taken right here from the 1st Division's museum. This is the 6th Field Artillery Regiment, and the picture's self-explanatory. This gun fired the first shot in anger, at least cannon shot, for the United States in the First World War. And that was, look at that, October the 23rd, and we were at war April the 6th. Whoops. Okay. The gun weighed almost 2,000 pounds, and when it was placed, everybody got involved. And that included forward observers like my grandfather. So the gun had to be moved. Now, normally with the forward observer, and by the way, this is not the natural elevation of the barrel. The gun would be propped up in order to get an elevation like that. So what you're not able to see here is there are going to be things that are propping that gun up like that. The gun would be placed so high, sometimes on roughly the equivalent of a cinder block, that when the gun would roll back, it would actually kill personnel. So one of the jokes was this gun had as much potential to kill you as it did the enemy. A little bit of an exaggeration, but the guns were moved by horse teams. Later in the war, there were a few tractors that were available, but normally it was horses that did this. Americans referred to shells as iron cigars or GI cans. Now, you may recall that in the Second World War and since, GI stands for government issue. So if you were GI Joe, you basically were issued by the United States government. But GI in the First World War meant galvanized iron. So when you hear GI can, that had nothing to do with an American GI. It was the casing and the surrounding that was utilized for the particular round that would come in. Church towers were a great place for forward observers. So often the very first thing that would be done is when you saw church towers, steeples, places of elevation, you shelled them, even if the town was unoccupied, because you wanted to play it safe. Normally, a forward observer is going to go out as far as they possibly can to be in an elevated position to scout an enemy. Now, today you would have wireless communications. In the First World War, the Signal Corps had trained Americans how to use field phones. And the field phones, which we're going to talk about in just a minute, the field phone, the most popular was the M1914 service buzzer. You could pick it up and talk into it, or it had a key that you could use Morse code on. So the forward observers had to be trained, and they were called artillery scouts in the First World War. They had to be trained in Morse code and in trench ciphers. Now, the phonetic alphabet that we think of, like World War II, Abel, Baker, Charlie, and then today, right, Alpha, Beta, Charlie, a little different back then. They didn't have it for all 26 letters, and they would just have, for instance, CF meant ceasefire. So if you were in a position near a battery and the battery commander was told CF from a forward observer, that would mean ceasefire. Reason that you'd want to cease fire is either you had destroyed the target or the artillery was falling on your own men, which was obviously known as friendly fire. This is an FT-17 Renault. There's a variation of these on the ground, one of these vehicles. The United States, this is a French tank. The United States purchased those as well from the French. You can see as these Americans, these are shells about to come in, and the town had already been taken. There's a dead German lying in the road. After the artillery did its job and basically obliterated something, the streets weren't clean like this. The combat engineers would have to come in, and the engineers would clean all of the rubble from the roadside, because ideally the infantry and then all the supply wagons behind them would follow. And that might look something like this. So as you can see, artillery pieces, horses were extensively used. This is how the artillery scouts got around. They also were not issued a rifle, even though they had to qualify on one. So my grandfather carried an M1911 .45 caliber automatic, a Colt. The French 75 was pulled by a team of 6 horses. When you were assigned a horse or a mule, you were responsible for it, just like anything else. So if that horse died or that mule died or was abused or in any sense was killed as a result of something other than enemy action, you had to answer for it, right down to, guess what? You own it, right? Just like in a china shop. You broke it, you own it. Let me see if the next picture has a little bit more of what I wanted to mention. Okay. One of the great advantages that we got during the First World War was a new invention called white phosphorus, or what you guys might know today as Willie Pete, or WP. White phosphorus burns, and it burns continually. So if that goes into your skin, somebody has to get a knife or a bayonet or something and dig that out, because it just continues to burn. The British developed this in 1916, and as you can see with this attack at night, that really tends to light up the area. And as you can also see over here, this was just loaded with rows and rows of barbed wire. So teams would have to crawl forward with wire cutters and try and cut through that. Oftentimes the artillery barrages were useless against this. Artillery could also contain gas. That's where most of the gas came from, artillery shells, not from canisters. The first few gas attacks in 1915 were done with canisters. The difficulty with using gas in a canister, you have an enemy that's 100 or 200 yards away in another trench, and you put a canister near the edge of a trench line, and then you open that up so that the gas can go over the parapet, and you can probably guess, you have to hope the wind is with you, right? Because if that shifts, which it often did, right, you're the victim of your own attack. When it was first used at Ypres in 1915, there was a very clever officer there who had studied chemistry, and he recognized that the brass buttons on the uniforms were turning green, and he knew that was a reaction from chlorine gas, right? And we're always told, you might remember, if you ever clean, right, don't clean indoors with the windows closed. I shouldn't say don't clean indoors, but don't clean with your window. And don't mix cleaning fluids. Because chlorine gas, the first of the three major gases that were used in the First World War, that's just ammonia and bleach mixed together, right? Don't do anything naughty now that you know that, but that's what that is. And he recognized that. Now, urea is a component in urine rather. So what he knew, I'm sure they have it in Europe too, but what he had people do was take out their handkerchiefs and urinate into those, and it would crystallize the chlorine. So the initial gas masks that the French issued were basically the equivalent of a cloth diaper and a pair of goggles. And they figured, you're going to get scared when you see that gas cloud coming. So just go ahead and soak that urine down and put that on your face and you'll be protected. The Germans invented masks with charcoal filters, and then the British quickly followed suit. So the British developed the small box respirator, and that's mostly what the United States, again, used. By the way, you had to have that on within 6 seconds. So when you pulled the mask down, you had to have a close haircut and a real close shave. You'd pull the mask down. There were a set of clips that went over the nose. There was a snorkel-like device that went in the mouth. 6 seconds to be on. Now, as an observer, you also had to take care of your horse. So you were supposed to be able to get the mask on the horse in 60 seconds. And the joke was, don't worry about it because the horse will be dead in 30. But the horse, the stories that my grandfather had told, now mind you, I wasn't quite 4 when he passed, so these all came to me from my father. But the story that he would tell is his horse, Annabelle, the first time or two that he went to put that mask on, she loved it. She thought it was a feed bag. She was all, this is great, right? After that, and I don't know and I can't imagine it's any more pleasant for a horse than it would be for a human being, but the inside of the gas mask was cheesecloth for the animals. So when that mask was put on, that's what that horse had basically jammed into its mouth in an effort to protect it. So not a fun thing to have to deal with. Forward observers, as I said, you're generally at the furthest point out. That's where you're going to be able to locate where the enemy's at. And by the way, the enemy's doing the same thing, and they know you're there. So in the meantime, what they're going to do is have snipers who are looking at any position where a forward observer can be so they can instantly kill them when they pop their head over the top to peek around. The other thing that they do is, as I said, these areas are pre-sighted. So as soon as they see any type of human activity or suspect it, they immediately call in artillery fire to pulverize that position. When the field phones would report into a command post or to a battery, this was a telephone operator who would receive that. They would take down the information, and as I said, it was also in cipher. So it was coded. Now the thought was that the Germans had, and this is more myth than reality, but the thought was the Germans have crystal radio sets which can interfere or receive our transmissions. That's kind of sketchy, but that was what the doughboys believed. Here's an observation post. That's high up in a tree. This picture, I'm sorry, the bottom portion is cut off. That's very high in a tree. And certainly when you were up there, you were very vulnerable. The problem with your ability to communicate with a wired communication, the wires were often severed by artillery fire. Or maybe you had sappers or people of that nature who would come along and cut them. So what these people had to do was they would use a sketch pad, and they would sketch out where that area was, utilizing their maps through land navigation. They'd place down the coordinates of where those positions were at. Then they'd have to get down and get on a horse and actually ride back. When you were trained as an artillery observer, you were normally trained in a pair, and I'll show you that in just a sec. Oh, one other thing, too. Here you can go. You can see again. You see the wires coming down? There's a field phone. And this is a forward trench, and there you are. You're expected to take up position there. If you were lucky, you might be given a telescope to peer over the top, which would reduce your chance of being killed by a sniper. Here we can see, once again, this is spotting from an elevated position, and the reason they operated in pairs, with a newer science, they wanted to be certain that they had recorded those coordinates correctly, so when one person would actually read off what they had thought, those things were written down, the other person would go up and verify that. And then one of those individuals, if they didn't have an operating field phone, would have to ride back with that information. Once again, another pair, always in teams. My grandfather, Len Fairfield, his compatriot was Al Slowey. And here's two teams. Here's a casemate. So the casemate is when you dig out and you actually place artillery pieces in there. You'd normally have 3 artillery pieces. These would be for bigger siege guns, like 155s, which existed in the First World War. The Germans had Krupp guns, which were up to 210 millimeters, so those were big shells. You would have gas shells as well as high explosives, shrapnel shells. The gas shells were marked by color. So you might have yellow for mustard gas, then you might have blue for chlorine, and you might have green for phosgene. And then you had cocktails where they would mix these things together, phosgene and chlorine. Normally what these gases did is they attack any area of the skin that's moist, so that's your eyes, your lungs. As I said, not often fatal, unless they had cyanide mixes in there, which we used at San Miguel. But they were a problem in terms of blindness, even temporary blindness. Adolf Hitler was gassed in the last few days of the war, spent them in a hospital, and he regained his eyesight, much to the world's chagrin. A camouflaged casemate. Artillery duels. So the idea is if you can neutralize somebody else's artillery, and in the First World War this was referred to as counter-battery fire. So in other words, if we can find through flashes when they actually fire their guns where those enemy guns are located and we can destroy them, then we will have an unopposed field of fire from our artillery onto the enemy's infantry. So these battles would take place constantly. Now, you not only had observation from the ground, but in the First World War you also had planes, so you had observation from the sky. And they had wireless Morse code that could be utilized on the plane, so they could get the information to the ground relatively quickly, or they had observation balloons, which were filled with not helium, but hydrogen. So they were explosive, so you used incendiary bullets to take those down. They looked like big sausages, so both sides tended to refer to the enemy's balloons as sausages. You needed orders to destroy a balloon, to fire incendiary bullets, because the planes were made of wooden canvas, and if you fired incendiary bullets at an enemy plane, you could start it on fire very rapidly. And since parachutes were only used in the last 4 to 6 weeks of the war by the Germans, because they didn't want pilots panicking and bailing out, you had to ride your plane down on fire. And every good pilot stored within quick reach a pistol to use on themselves, or you could jump and take your chances, right? So counter-battery fire. So this type of extensive camouflage was necessary in order to protect your artillery pieces. These are the guns being lined up just before the Battle of San Miguel. Now, this was America's first. This is where my grandfather got involved. This was in September of 1918. This was America's first really major battle, only 10 weeks or so before the war ended. 3,000 guns were set up to shell San Miguel. San Miguel was, well, I have a photo that'll show the map. I'll explain that a little bit in just a second. 3,000 guns, that was more guns that were used during all of 1916 during the Battle of Verdun, which went from February to December of 1916. This was set up because St. Mihiel was a salient. So a salient is kind of like your finger. You poke it through if you were to penetrate something with your finger, and you've got three sides, basically the front and then the top and the bottom. So that's a salient. And that was what the Germans had done in 1914. They had seized St. Mihiel. That interrupted communications toward the city of Verdun. So this was their way of being able to hold this. They had tried several times with many, many thousands of lives lost. So the job fell to the Americans to take it. And what we did was we not only lined up 3,000 guns, but we weren't aware of this at the moment, but we had a 10-to-1 superiority. The Germans were actually evacuating St. Mihiel at the time the battle began, and they did it at the worst possible time. By pure coincidence, they were evacuating just as we began our artillery barrage. And of course, being caught out in the open is the worst possible thing that can happen. So the German 77th Reserve Division was just cut to pieces. Also, the Americans used cyanide gas in their shells. Here we can see, this is the salient. Along this area here, along the bottom, and right up here, these were all American outfits. The French 2nd Corps was right here. The American 5th Corps was just above, and right down here would be the area that my grandfather was in, supporting none other than the 1st Infantry Division. So this was America's first really big conflict in the First World War, and as I said, it's right toward the end. This was an overwhelming victory for the United States and kind of gave us a false sense of security. Wow, these, as they were Heinis, right? The derogatory name for Germans in the First World War, a variation of the name Heinrich. So the Heinis seemed to be very much on the run, and it seemed that the United States was going to wrap up a quick victory. The thought was, right, Thiaucourt, that the Americans would move northwest into Germany proper and take the city of Metz and win the war. Well, the British and the French had other ideas, so they diverted America from going into Germany and taking the city of Metz, and instead we were sent to the Argonne Forest, which was the most fortified position in all of Europe during World War II, and which would cost us 26,000 lives. If you've ever read Michael Hallis, a book called Squandered Victory, what Hallis contends is we could have won the war weeks ahead of time with far fewer casualties, that we could have taken Metz and that would have brought the Germans to surrender. But the British and the French, according to Mr. Hallis, said, we're not going to let the upstart Americans who just got here and haven't really shed any blood win this great victory. We're going to do this. It's a great historical what if. My father kind of had a little bit of answer for those who defend the British and the French, because during World War II, when General Patton was making his drive, he went right across here, and in September of 1944, he went to the city of Metz, and they ran out of gas, and it rains all the time. Bless you. Rains all the time in Lorraine, especially in the fall. So it turns it into a quagmire of mud, and that was General Patton's only defeat, was in the fall of 1944. If you watch the movie Patton, he has this great success. He goes through France in August of 1944 in a month, and it's wonderful. And then it jumps to the Battle of the Bulge. Well, they kind of forget September, October, November, and December, the first part of December, when the Americans, my father and the 5th Infantry Division, were bogged down trying to take Metz. And 90% of the riflemen in the 5th Infantry Division in World War II became casualties. So again, I guess there's two sides to every coin. And someone could say that maybe the British and the French made the right decision. Who knows? The Argonne, and this is the area that my grandfather was in. He was in the Americans attacked in a three-pronged section. So left flank, right flank, and then straight up the middle. This was the area that my grandfather moved in on Montfaucon. This is an area that a great many Americans died. The 32nd Infantry Division had exceptionally large casualties here. Basically everybody in the Argonne. The Argonne was considered so impenetrable that the British and the French said we would never even dream of attacking it. The Germans had converted many of their trench areas. They had living room furniture and things like that in there. They figured if we're going to be here, we're going to be here in comfort, especially if we're not going to get bothered. So they reinforced everything with concrete, and then they brought in nice things so that they could enjoy something close to civilian living. This offensive started on September the 26th, 1918, and would go right through until the armistice on November the 11th. And my grandfather was there at the last French town to be liberated, which was Stenay. And it's kind of interesting to note that the war ended, as you all know, on 11/11/11, right? 11 o'clock in the morning on the 11th day of the 11th month. There were more Americans killed in that period until 11 a.m. in the morning on that day than were killed at Normandy in World War II. So instead of saying, well, we'll hunker down and we'll just wait this out, it's all going to be over in a few hours, they decided one last push for glory, and we'll see if we can't bring ourselves to victory. This is, there's a Hotchkiss machine gun. That's a crude anti-aircraft. That's just an axle turned up on its side. As you can see, the gun, the axle will allow you, the wheel will allow you to move around in a 360, and then, of course, you get elevation by just moving that gun in an upward or downward position. Liberty trucks brought the doughboys everything they wanted, chocolate, sardines, whatever it might happen to be, and when you got back from the front, they just threw it out to you. So you had to pick up your stuff and go enjoy it. Delousing. This often didn't do you too much good. Usually either when you got back to the trenches or if you were like my grandfather and you were an observer, you had horses and you generally were around hay, and the hay was infested with lice. So as your clothes would be deloused in a steam container, the men would take baths in their helmets with soapy water. And they would hopefully be all cleaned up and ready to go, only to be reinfested in another hour or two. Here you can notice noon on the road, like a little chimney right here. This is what's called a rolling kitchen. You can see the wheels. The soldiers referred to them as soup cannons because of the little spout at the top. So they were able to get hot grub. Sardines, which were known as goldfish. Bullets were baked beans. I don't have to tell you about SOS. Everybody's going to know about that, right? I used to call it that when my wife would serve it, so it's just something other than special, right, darling? So usually bacon and bacon grease. What they would do is they would pour bacon grease on bread. It was very filling. It would sit on the stomach. It would fill you up. Food wasn't, and of course the wonderful biscuits, or hardtack as they're known. Even in the Second World War, my father said they were basically the equivalent of a dog biscuit. So you not only had to soak it, but many of the men would use their bayonets or trench knives to chip away at it and then put the pieces in their mouth. That was not pleasant. The British thought if they pre-canned them in water, that would be more advantageous. It wasn't. The Salvation Army, they actually sent 500 volunteers who went to the front lines, and they actually baked. They served lemonade and sandwiches and coffee. And, of course, this is where the great cardiac staple comes from. Who knows how many doughboys this ended up killing. But donuts were, in World War II, you fought for mom's apple pie, right? But in the First World War, it was donuts. That's what doughboys loved. And they got their fill of them. And they loved the American Red Cross, or the Salvation Army, I'm sorry, because these people actually came to the front line. Some German POWs just thrilled, as you can see, with the war almost over. They knew that they had no chance for victory. We had put 2 million men in the field by the fall of 1918. They had no hope of meeting those numbers. They were very quick to surrender. Just like the Second World War, there were a number of teenagers who were in uniform who were too young under normal standards for military service. And also, too, the Battle of the Bulge in World War II was not the very first time that Germans would impersonate Americans in U.S. uniforms. What would often happen in the early stages of the war, the Americans would be involved in various skirmishes at this place or that place, and they would be proving to be victorious. And all of a sudden, an American officer would show up shouting in perfect English, "Fall back! We have to retreat! Everybody fall back!" Well, it was a German. So by the time San Miguel came, the enlisted men were told, which they just relished, if you see an officer you don't recognize ordering retreat, shoot him. This is from the Army National Guard in Springfield, the 33rd Division. These were the Christmas cards. Boy, doesn't everybody look happy and jolly as they recuperate? Most of these fellas had never been far from home, and of course, as you can imagine, wartime, even if it had just ended, Christmas, everybody wants to be back home. That's not a pleasant experience. And of course, here we are in Luxembourg with occupation as the war has ended. And you can see this gentleman is raising up a donut. He's really thrilled. They're drinking hot chocolate. I don't know if anybody's into ghost photography, if we have any people who like that kind of thing. What's interesting is this is from the National Guard. See this individual here in the window? I have this picture in my book, the exact same picture. He's not there. Oh. So donuts and hot chocolate in Luxembourg. You know, this was kind of a sad thing. Oh, by the way, you can see, here's the insignia, right? On the 33rd Division has the Yellow Cross. So they're known as the Prairie Division or the Yellow Cross Division. Where did that come from? During the Spanish-American War, there were volunteers from, at that time it was the 2nd Infantry from Illinois, and they were in the Philippines. And for some reason, I guess it's a combination of Catholicism and superstition, the Americans discovered that if they painted crosses on their equipment, the Filipinos wouldn't touch it. It wouldn't be stolen. So I'm not sure where the yellow comes from, but that was where that comes from. So sometimes people think because they served in the Philippines in World War II that that's where the insignia got started, but actually, as you can see, there it is in World War I, and according to their records, that's what that's a result of. My grandmother, she was, this is a picture, she was at a pro-American rally supporting the war. Not that, my grandfather did not really support the war. He was like a lot of conscripts. He felt, I've been drafted, I'll do my duty. His belief was, if we stay out of this, they're going to come to some kind of a equitable solution. They're all going to be basically in the same position. But my grandmother, who felt very much like my grandfather, wanted to, once he was over there, wanted to support him. So this was at a bond rally, and what they would have is they would dress a woman up like Columbia, and then the ladies who would assist her were known as Liberty Ladies. So they would hold the train of her dress or whatever it might happen to be. So there's a picture of my grandmother, Margaret Noonan, later Margaret Fairfield, as a Liberty Lady. The experience, just to kind of wrap that up, how did people, well, the Treaty of Versailles, which was signed in June of 1919, made Germany totally responsible for the war, and they had to pay reparations for it. So the Germans turned on the printing presses, and German currency became worthless. The German economy did crash with ours in 1929, and of course Hitler came to power, and a lot of the Germans were feeling that vengeance was the order of the day. And as one French general said, when the Treaty of Versailles was signed in June of 1919, what you have is a 20-year armistice. And he was off, considering the war started in September of 1939, he was only off by 3 months. So unfortunately, it was prophetic. It also gave us the Soviet Union. It gave us countries that didn't exist before, like Iran, and colonial leadership in the Middle East, which, again, kind of haunts us to this day. So we know it was not the war to end all wars, and certainly was it costly to the United States? Absolutely, in every sense of the word. I'll leave it to historians to decide whether that's, other historians, to decide whether or not that was in America's best interest. But that concludes my remarks, and if there's any questions from you, it's certainly been a great pleasure to talk to all of you this evening. I'd certainly be happy to answer them.
So we would like to take questions right now, but please wait for a microphone. Raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone around. That way we can get it on the recording. Thank you.
We have the first one over here. Hi, Jim. Thank you. Nice job. I have a question about your grandfather specifically. How did he end up becoming this forward observer, this artillery scout? Did he volunteer, or did it just use his math background, or did it just
That's
happen?
An excellent question. The soldiers were tested. You got either the A or the B test. If you scored well on the A test, you moved up to another set of testing, which was a little bit more specific in things that they thought you were acclimated to, such as mathematics. The B test was for those who were illiterate. It was pictures. And you may have heard about the hayfoot, strawfoot. There were literally men who didn't know their right from their left, so they would literally have a piece of hay on one and a piece of straw on the other, and they'd hayfoots left, right, left, right. So that was not an exaggeration. There were still a number of Americans who were illiterate at the time of the First World War. Even though my grandfather was self-educated, as I said, he was a stationary engineer. He was licensed in that. He did quite well, and it was the testing. They decided mathematical acclamation. In terms of determining artillery coordinates, that's done through trigonometry. So it's going to be, well, you're going to utilize I'll get it. You understand. It's a very complicated procedure. The battery commander would actually have to give the authorization as to elevation of the gun, rate of fire, the whole 9 yards.
Do we have any other questions? Right over here.
I'm just curious, what was your grandfather's rank throughout the war?
He finished private first class. I have a shadow box. Some of those are his authentic items. Now, what I had to do with a little bit of this is to use some commemoratives. You can see the yellow cross. That is the insignia for the 33rd Infantry Division. The large A is for the 1st Army. You can also see the crossed cannons, which I believe are going to be in your lower right. The crossed cannons are private first class stripes, which he was promoted to on February the 18th of 1918. The Red Chevron, oh, what a dear. Thank you so much. That is so kind. The Red Chevron is an honorable discharge chevron, and you could wear your uniform for 90 days after your discharge. And the Red Chevron was put point down on the lower portion of your sleeve, and that showed that, like I said, not only an honorable discharge, but they couldn't charge you on the rails. So there was basically no excuse for not being able to get home. You could take a train anywhere. So that included not only commuters, but national lines that would go back and forth. These medals here are all... The only official medal that he could have worn on his uniform would be the World War I Victory Medal, and it has 3 battle clasps on there, one for San Miel, one for the Argonne, and one known as defensive sector. That just meant he was involved in a few different skirmishes, but nothing that would be noted beyond that. These French campaign medals, the yellow and the red, that is in 1936, the city of San Miel issued a medal. You had to write to them to get it. In 1961, and my grandfather passed in 62, they wanted to raise money for war memorials. That's a medal to the Argonne Offensive. And then the Verdun sector. My father got this same medal because the 5th Infantry Division on August the 31st, 1944, liberated Verdun. So the 5th Infantry Division is one of the very few World War II outfits that was actually granted the Verdun Medal. But if you fought between the Meuse River and the Argonne Forest, that was the Verdun sector, so you were entitled to that medal. The Victory Medal, these medals are similar, which these are unofficial commemoratives, but they denote service that, since World War II, generally has been issued in medal form. So this would be combat service, this would be defense of the United States. Then we have expeditionary service, overseas service, and finally honorable service. The Americans who served in Luxembourg are not entitled to the occupation medal, which has General Pershing's, the commander of the American forces in World War I. It has his image and a black ribbon. You had to serve in either Austria-Hungary or Germany proper. So my grandfather was part of the Army of Occupation in Reserve. By the way, his horse Annabelle survived the war. He said that was a very touching parting. He gave her some sugar cubes, and he said deep down he felt she knew that he was leaving. So he said she was a real friend. Authentic buttons, those were his. Those were the crossed cannons, again in the U.S. They never made a combat badge for artillery. They have the combat infantry badge, the CIB, for the infantry. But this is something for shadow boxes that would just show that he had been in combat as an artilleryman. The dog tags were about the size of a $50. They were made of aluminum. They came with either a canvas strap or a leather strap. And the service stripes were for overseas service. They were not actually approved until 1920. But if you've ever noticed the movie George Patton, you'll notice on his sleeve it's George C. Scott portraying Patton. And Patton has 4 of these, which is the maximum number. Nobody was considered to have more than 2 years of overseas service. But you got 1 gold chevron for every 6 months of service. On the authentic World War I uniforms, the men sewed them themselves. They were as large as the red stripe or as small as the official issue that came out in 1920. Sometimes they looked like a tiny little butterfly if you look at some of the photographs. And as I said, always 2 sets of dog tags, your name and outfit on the first and your serial number on the back, because one would be left with the body and then one would be turned in by graves registration so that the person could be listed as KIA. Last 2 things, that little brass button, which is basically the American Legion symbol. That is the victory lapel pin. It's given in silver if you were wounded. The Purple Heart was not approved as a medal until 1932. And then that's the seal or the insignia rather, for the 124th Field Artillery. So certainly, I think he'd be amazed if he saw that. He'd go, "What? I didn't know." But I wish I could have had a chance to talk to him. Fortunately, he kept diaries. I had his letters, his postcards, and he spoke at length with my father. I think there was that bond that the 2 of them had served in combat, actually in some of the same geographical areas. So I think those things that he didn't normally talk about with others, he had shared with my dad, and my dad shared those with me. Thank you very much. I believe there's a gentleman over here who had a question.
So we got a question right here, and then we'll go over there.
Okay, very good.
I have 2 separate questions.
Sure.
One is for all those who had to sign up for the draft, were there any restrictions for, let's say, people who were German immigrants or people who came from countries that we were fighting as far as what they could do or even if they entered the service?
If you were not a citizen of the United States, and at that time it still took 5 years to be living here and you could take a naturalization test, you had to register. If you were an Austrian-Hungarian or a German, you had to register as an enemy alien.
Oh, okay.
And you still had to register for the draft.
Yeah.
You still, even if you weren't a citizen yet, and you could get citizenship by joining the military. My paternal grandfather, my dad's dad, came to the United States in 1912 from Austria-Hungary because he knew the war was coming. He was a draft dodger from the European side. He wasn't about to, he filled out his draft card, but as long as they didn't call him, he wasn't about to go.
Oh, okay.
The enemy alien list, most of those during the Red Scare of 1919, and the Attorney General at that time, General Palmer, most of the records were destroyed shortly after that. After the war, they didn't consider the need to archive that type of information like they would today. And that, along with a lot of the records that were seized with the International Workers of the World, or the Wobblies, those were all burned in the early 1920s.
Oh, okay. Now, a separate question.
Sure.
During World War I, the psychological trauma from shell fire and everything was called shell shock. Now, I know the British in World War II used the term LMF, lack of moral fiber. Did they also use that in World War I?
I'm not aware of whether or not it's interesting, I have a book on World War I medicine from the American perspective. I can't attest to that. However, universally it was recognized that there was something of that condition existing. In other words, that men weren't being true men of grit. Remember I mentioned to you today, we think of the Pillsbury Doughboy and we laugh with the... From the time of the First World War up until roughly the time of the Second World War ending, when you said doughboy, that would be the almost the equivalent today of saying like an Army Ranger or a Marine. I mean, there was this aspect that, wow, this is really a tough individual. And again, both Marines and Army were doughboys. And one other thing, do we have any Marines in the outfit? Okay, great, Semper Fi. One of the things about the Marines, there's always this touchy aspect of one outfit being under command of the other. They didn't have enough Marines when they went to France to have their own division. So the Marines who fought at Belleau Wood were actually under the 2nd Infantry Division of the United States Army. So they were part of, and if you might recognize, you see that insignia in Saving Private Ryan. It's the large Indian head. That's the insignia for the 2nd Infantry Division. And that was where the Marines were assigned, or the Devil Dogs, as they were called by the Germans. And this gentleman has a question.
I grew up in a heavily German immigrant community, and knew a lot of World War II veterans. The veterans, the young men that served, they all spoke German. They talked about going overseas, and and talking to the Germans in the other trenches occasionally. But the older generation were very much against the war. They were very pro-German, like my grandfather. How did that play out in other places? This is in the Midwest.
There were a lot of, as you know, things like sauerkraut had to be changed to Liberty cabbage. There were a number of German-American shops that were smashed, property owners that lost everything due to, this occurred in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois. Those are ones I know specifically. I'm sure it probably happened in other places. There was a very strong anti-German sentiment, and the idea was if you were German, almost something kind of what would happen with Japanese Americans in World War II. You had to go that extra mile. You had to buy war bonds. You had to buy war stamps, everything you could possibly do to support the war effort. And there were many instances of the Kaiser being hung in effigy and people saying this is what we should be doing to any Germans who sympathize with him. My grandfather came from an English-Irish background. And as you know, many Irish Americans, because of their feelings toward England, were not at all enthusiastic about the United States entering the war as an ally of England. So it wasn't just Germans. A lot of the Irish were very upset too. My grandfather's animosity on the war was based on what he considered an aspect of common sense. It really wasn't an ethnic thing. My grandfather was born and raised in Chicago. He didn't have quite that same strong ethnic binge, but he just felt that it was a mistake. And one of the things, too, what he had mentioned about the Second World War, which I list in my book, is, he said after all that bloodshed in the Second World War and then the agreements at Potsdam and Yalta and Eastern Europe went to the Soviet Union, and he said all we effectively did was take the P out of Prussia. And the whole thing just became Russia all the way up to, part of Germany. Part of the reason I didn't tell you, go into great deals of detail about my grandfather is I wouldn't mind if you'd bought the book. That's great. Believe me, it's a good read. You're going to like it. But yeah, that's, there are a number of, like I said, experiences he had where he felt that, look, I'm an American, I've been drafted, I'll do my duty. And he did. He was never decorated for any particular act of valor, but my feeling has always been, first of all, when people serve, even if they're conscripted, they go in and they serve, we owe them all of our gratitude and honor. And then especially, I think that's even more so when they serve in combat. And I don't know how to put it any other way than that. You guys are great. My son back there, he just returned from 10 months in Jordan doing training troops, and their outfit was doing border patrol. And it just, like I said, some things are the same as they were 100 years ago, and other things are dramatically different. Yes, sir.
Based upon the carnage that takes place in all these wars, could you comment on the medical corps in Europe in the First World War?
The Rose of No Man's Land, that was what there's a song from the First World War that the Americans developed to talk about the nursing corps and what they were able to do. One of the two large areas came out of the First World War, and of course a third kind of in a less, what would I want to say, less scientific way, which would be psychiatry, dealing with those who had, today we think of nostalgia as a good word. Nostalgia was actually what American veterans from the American Civil War, when they experienced trauma from the war, that was the first thing that physicians called it, was nostalgia. And today, if you're being nostalgic, that would be considered kind of a good thing. Two other things, orthopedics, and then plastic surgery. And many of the men, the French used to call them, because you had kind of a grape shot or almost like a canister shot from the First World War, and these things would explode and throw basically steel balls out onto the battlefield. And the French used to call a number of the casualties the men with no faces, because you would literally see an individual who just had two eye holes. Their face had just been removed by these projectiles. Faces were reconstructed, and they were often made out of things like porcelain, and they were held on with artificial glasses. wired-rimmed glasses, and the glasses would go behind the ears, and that would hold on the face. So many of the breakthroughs that we saw with facial reconstruction and plastic surgery and orthopedics came from there. It's one added thing to your question. The United States, World War I was the last war where more Americans died from disease than died from battle wounds. 63,000 from disease, 53,000 from battle wounds. So they were able to make some progress. You still didn't have penicillin. That was still over a decade away. Morphine, of course, existed. That had been around since the Civil War. Heroin would soon come into existence. That was an attempt to develop a non-addicting painkiller. That one didn't work out quite so well. Well, yes, sir.
Here we go.
You mentioned all of the casualties which took place, and with there being more people dying on the last day of the war than died at D-Day. Mm-hmm. Was there any attempt to kind of investigate the generals for maybe not being up to snuff or for being kind of callous with
There were congressional hearings. There were congressional hearings in 1920, and they considered trying to make a case against some of these generals, General Bullard being one of them. The decision was made that these individuals had distinguished war records, and this would not serve any purpose. So basically, it was whitewashed. But there were congressional hearings on it, and there was a lot of outrage at the time. Basically, one of the attempts to capture a position was so that the soldiers would have a nice place to bathe. They wanted to take an area that had a bathhouse, and many died as a result of that. So, hardly a strategic objective.
Well, if that's all that we have right now, please join me in thanking Jim for his talk. And as we always do, I would like to present you with the 1st Division Museum coin.
Thank you.
In the traditional fashion.
Thank you so
You're
much.
welcome.
I appreciate that, JD. That means a great deal. Thank you.
Thank you so much for everything. We appreciate it. So, as always, we have a couple final announcements just to... Nick, can you... Okay, so anyway, the next date with history will be in June. It's on the 6th of June, so slightly off our normal schedule. And it'll be by retired Colonel Greg Fontenot. He has written a book about basically kind of the Cold War buildup and then Operation Desert Storm with the 1st Infantry Division. He commanded a battalion of the 1st Infantry Division during the entire 3-day ground campaign of Operation Desert Storm. So that'll be coming on June 6th. Also, as you might know, this is the 100-year anniversary of the founding of the 1st Infantry Division. It's been on continuous active duty ever since it was founded in 1917 for World War I, and we're going to celebrate that. So we would like to invite all of you to come out. We're going to have an event. We're calling it the Toast of the Army. We're going to do a traditional punch bowl. There's going to be different activities. You're going to be able to check out some new interesting artifacts, talk to our curator. We're going to have a lot of great food and music, and it's going to be a lot of fun. And that's going to be on the evening of June 2nd. So if you're interested and you want to make sure you get your ticket before they all sell out, they're selling them in the gift shop right after this, so you can rush over and make sure you can be one of the first people to come. But this is going to be a really cool event, and we're going to celebrate the 100 years of history that the 1st Infantry Division has been a part of. Also, just so you know, the American Legion is in the back, as they always are, and they're collecting any loose change or money you'd like to donate to the Midwest Shelter for Homeless Veterans, a really amazing organization that does a lot of good for our veterans who kind of need it the most. So with that, thank you for everything. I hope you enjoyed the evening, and have a good night.